Hey, Fabrice.
Hi.
All right, so there's a lot of people here who had a chance to chat with you during the members networking, but also a bunch of people that did not get to hear you tell your story. So I'm curious, how did you get excited originally about marketplaces?
I think like most things in life, it's a combination of like serendipity, luck, and I guess living in a world of constrained resources. So there's no doubt in my mind from reasonably earlier age that I was going to be a tech entrepreneur. Got a PC when I was 10 in 1984, and I started coding and building BBSs and building computers. I was a really strange kid being in France when everyone else was on Minitel and no one had a computer. And I went to Princeton kind of at the right time. Now, the luck part was, because I was looking up to people like Steve Jobs or Bill Gates, I became an aspirational entrepreneur, but it never occurred to me that what I was doing would become a big industry. So, my hobby became this gazillion-dollar industry, and I was at the right time, at the right place, with the right skills. In terms of why marketplaces is, when I went to Princeton, and it struck me that economics was a great framework for explaining the world, and I loved how you could take, I guess, opaque and fragmented markets and bring transparency, liquidity, which created a lot of value. And so marketplaces conceptually were really interesting to me. And then I worked for a few years at McKinsey, and then at 98, wanted to build my first startup. And that's where the resource constraint arrived. When you're 23, and you have very limited capital and also no experience, building things like in 1998, like Amazon, you needed billions of capital, supply chain skills that I didn't have and wouldn't be available to me. At the same time, if I want to build whatever in E-Trade, you need a banking license and millions of dollars. Whereas the things I really loved, marketplaces, felt more intuitive and logical to me to build in a world of limited resources. And so I started there and basically never looked back.
Amazing. And now, as you share a bunch of your intimate stories with us through the course of your career, I thought it would be great for us to do this literally by the fire. So I'm just going to turn on the fireplace here, just to make it a little cozy so you feel good sharing with us. So that's an amazing start to how you got excited about marketplaces. Looking back now at your career to date, what's been your, the most professional success you've had that you're most proud of?
Well, funnily enough, maybe the day I'm the proudest of is the day my second company became profitable. So the first company, I was 23 to 26. It was during the bubble days, and basically via the right pedigree, people threw money at you. And people in today's age don't realize what a bubble is like unless you were in the crypto space. But just by saying, Princeton, McKinsey, Internet, and we raised $63 million in venture money. I was getting faxed, signed term sheets that were binding from people I never met before. I mean, that's a bubble. The companies are being sold for billions with no revenues, no profits, nothing. Sadly, to some extent, the bubble burst before I could actually cash out. The company was doing really well. I wanted to sell it to the right buyer, which was eBay. Sadly, my majority owner made me sell to someone else, and the stock fell 99.98%. Their 10 billion market cap went to 30 million, and lost pretty much everything. And so in 2001, I went through a few months of soul searching and thinking through, okay, what do I do next? And I realized, I didn't build a startup because I wanted to make money. I built one because I wanted to be an entrepreneur. I'm not really employable. I love building something out of nothing. And so the only constraint is I want to be an entrepreneur, and I'm willing to compromise on everything else. And the everything else was, frankly, building a product I didn't particularly care for, customers I didn't particularly care for, and it didn't really matter because I wanted to build a startup and needed to be profitable, or at least not require a lot of capital in a world where in 2001 it was like the world had ended. The internet is not going to be a thing anymore, and all the D2C companies that got bankrupt, all the B2C companies that got bankrupt, all the telecom companies that got bankrupt, and all the VCs were out of cash. And so invested every last penny I had. I went and met and begged and groveled from every person I met to get some capital for my company. Missed payroll 23 times over the course of 2.5 years. I lived in New York on essentially $2 a day, which basically meant I actually could only afford ramen noodle. They are not just a thing of urban legend, but it is the only thing I could afford. I couldn't even afford coffee. So I slept on the couch at the office. We had a shower in the office, and I lived there for 2 years. Built the company the old-fashioned way, through profits. Finally, And I remember the date very clearly, on August 15 of 2003, after having raised 1.4 million, but in 5K increments or 10K increments. And we'd miss payroll so many times, I would tell the employees, I don't understand, the bank made a mistake again this month. I don't understand why they didn't process payroll. Of course, I didn't have any money to pay for it. And then I would find someone that I'd convince to give me 5K or 10K, and we'd make it. But then, of course, I tapped out everyone I knew for every dollar I could. And we missed payroll for 4.5 months in a row. We went from 27 to 7. So, because when you stop paying people, they stop showing up for work. Funny that. But ultimately became profitable, and that's that day. And that was the day that really switched everything, because then we were masters of our destiny. And so in 2002, we did $1 million revenues. In 2003, including becoming profitable, we did 5. Then 2004, we did 50 million in revenues. And in 2005, we did 200 million in revenues. And that company I sold, this time for cash, not for stock. A bit too early, but I'd learned that better too early than too late, for 80 million in June of 2004. But the day of the sale, which in a way, financially, you would think would change my life, was actually, I was so busy. We were growing like crazy. I still lived in my studio apartment for another 2 years. I think the big splurge I did is I bought an Xbox, a TV, and a better tennis racket. It didn't really change anything. But becoming profitable was the most meaningful achievement.
And even though you had the tennis racket and the Xbox, did you remember to make payroll that month?
Yeah, then it was easy. It was automated.
And so it's an amazing story. And so what brings you to Toronto particularly? There's a lot of cities that you could be in this evening, probably not with such a glorious fire, but why did you choose to spend your time here?
It started kind of, again, serendipitously. In 2016, I organized a marketplace conference in the Dominican Republic in Cabarete, and we had the CEOs of a whole bunch of marketplaces like Thumbtack, et cetera, and the CEO of Skip the Dishes happened to be there, and was, I guess, enthralled by our explanation of how we had built the company I built after the one I described, which was a company called OLX. And OLX is basically Kijiji for the rest of the world. It's the largest classified site in the world. It's 5,000 employees. It's 350 million unique visitors a month. We're the leading classified site in India, and Brazil, and Pakistan, and Russia, and Poland. I mean, basically all the emerging markets. And a big chunk, or a big way of which this was built, was on TV. And we built these CAC, we'd build these attributions models where we knew the underlying traffic of the site. Whenever we knew exactly which spot was playing when and where, so we knew how to do attribution to TV for new traffic. And we'd created these CAC to LTV models where TV actually turned out to be a cheaper way to scale than many of the other alternatives once we reached a certain scale. And you listen to that story, you thought it was compelling, and I made my first investment in Canada and Skip the Dishes. We, for free, as we do actually for portfolio companies, we help them build their TV strategy, and they scaled, and then they sold to Just Eat. And that led to an introduction to meeting Golden Ventures, which said, hey, you guys should take a look at Canada. And then we invested in Inkbox. And then, of course, met on Shoal and became a board member and investor and Properly. And so I started coming for board meetings here and building relationships with the local ecosystem. So meeting Inovia and Omers and Real Ventures and all the major VCs here. And in the last, basically, year, invested in 11 more startups. So now we're investors in 14 startups in Canada, almost all marketplaces, from Toolbox to Tread to CCU to BuzzBot to Buzz.com, et cetera.
Wow, that's amazing. And so I think the goal is when you leave here, it'll have gone from 14 to 28. It's probably what most people are thinking in here. So let's talk a little about your investments. You said mostly in marketplaces. Can you share with us sort of like the way that you think about valuing companies?
Sure. So taking a step back, we've invested in 475 startups. Last year, and because we're reasonably crazy, we invested 128. I was 97 first-time investments and 31 follow-ons. So every week we get about 100 startups. And of these 100 startups, maybe 60 are out of scope. I mean, they're great, but they're like space tech, hardware, IoT, things we don't look at. The other 40, we have a 1-hour evaluation process, and I'll describe it shortly. And then we get a report. Then these are presented every Tuesday during our 2-hour weekly investment call. And of these, most of them we decide not to invest in. A few I take calls. And on the second call, which I take 5 to 7 a week, we end up investing in 1 or 2 companies a week. And so maximum in 1 week and 2 1-hour meetings, we decide whether we invest in a startup. And so it's very different from most VCs because we're not leading, we're not pricing, we're not really doing any real due diligence, and we decide extremely quickly. Basically, I was thinking when I was an entrepreneur, what was it that I hated about being on the other side of the table? And I hated that I would go and meet a VC and we'd have a conversation, I thought it went great, and then I'd never hear back. Or there was never a clear timeline for when there was going to be a final decision. And VCs never said no because they wanted to keep the optionality of a yes. And I'm like, no, I want full transparency. And so we tell people where they stand, why we're investing, or why not. So to answer your question on like what are heuristics and criteria we use, it's frankly 4 top-level decisions, 3 of which are mutually inclusive. So all 3 need to be collectively true for us to make the investment. And the 4th one is more loosely held. So actually, I'll start with the more loosely held one. One is, does it meet our thesis? And we are a thesis-driven firm, so we think of what are the trends in the world and what are the trends in marketplaces and what are the things that we want to invest in. And there are 3 trends that we're investing in right now. One, I guess on Shoal showed it in his slide, it's the continued verticalization of the horizontal marketplaces. And it's not just the verticalization of the Craigslist and eBays of the world, but it's actually the verticalization of Thumbtack, Upwork, even something like Uber Eats is being verticalized, and you have companies like Slice, which are doing like pizza on-demand delivery, or Chowbus, which are for Chinese food. We're seeing verticalization even of things like YouTube with Twitch. And so verticalization of the horizontal platforms is one of the core theses. Second core thesis, of late, beyond the managed marketplaces, of which Properly is an example, there's another trend in marketplace design where the marketplace is picking the supplier for the consumer. So the old model on Kijiji, the buyer and the seller are having a conversation and you interact with a lot of people. The closing rate is actually reasonably painful. Or if you go to Thumbtack to hire a plumber, you have to talk to 300 of them, you need to negotiate a contract, you close one. The new model is the marketplace says, this is the person for you, right? So Uber, you're not picking your driver. And originally people thought that this was a model that could be only applied to a few categories, but we're seeing that you can apply to more and more and more categories and improve the user experience, improve the NPS, and frankly, ultimately improve the economics. And so this is happening in like transcription with companies like Rev.com. It's happening in picking someone to redo your lawn like Lawn Love, or redoing your floor like Renovizo, and many, many others. And the third big trend right now is B2B marketplaces. So all of the best practices that you're seeing in the consumer space, from Uber to Airbnb, et cetera, are now just starting to touch the B2B world, where a lot of transactions are still happening through Rolodex and Excel and email, as opposed to online transparent marketplaces. And so now we're investors in marketplaces for scrap metal, for petrochemicals, or for finding labor to do contract work on oil platforms, a company called RigUp. So one is, does your idea meet our thesis? Now, this is the loosely held one. Only 70% of what we invest in is marketplaces. Then there's like really cool stuff because I like you or I like the idea. And so this one is not completely held through. The other 3, though, need to be true collectively. So one is, do we like you as a founder? And our evaluation criteria, because everyone says, oh, we invest in amazing people. But what does amazing people mean? So for us, it's really 3 things. Are you an amazing storyteller? Because if you can weave a compelling story, you're going to have such a comparative advantage. You're going to raise money to higher prices. You're going to attract better people. You're going to get more PR and therefore probably more clients and better BD deals than anyone else. 2, how numbers driven are you? And it's important to us because we want positive unit economics. We want people that really understand their businesses, and many people that are amazing storytellers are actually not numbers driven. So we want both of those things to be true. And 3, do you have grit and tenacity? Meaning, as we push you in our conversation of 2 1-hour meetings, how do you hold up to us pushing you and challenging your assertions and assumptions? And the reality is, it's so hard to be an entrepreneur. If you can't withstand a little bit of heat in our conversation, you're not going to do well.
Have you seen some people fall apart in those 2 1-hour conversations?
I've made people cry. and not intentionally. It's just I preach and practice both in my personal life and professional life radical honesty, and I tell people where they stand. And so if I actually think that they don't know what they're talking about, or I don't like their business, or I don't like the approach they're taking, or I don't like the pitch, I will tell them that. And not everyone has it's not even a thick skin. It's not personal. It's like, this is an observation. It's like a fact-driven analysis, maybe biased, of where you stand. Next one is, do we like your business? And do we like your business is 9 underlying heuristics for us in terms of like total addressable market size, business model, et cetera. The most important is probably unit economics for us. And what we consider to be good unit economics, and now you may be pre-launch, in which case it's theoretical unit economics, or you're post-launch, and ideally it's good unit economics. And if they're not good, you need at least a compelling story as to how and why they're going to be good in the future. Now, good unit economics and marketplaces are one where you recoup your fully loaded CAC after 6 months. Your net contribution margin on a per customer basis is about 3x your fully loaded CAC after 18 months. And in an ideal world, you have no idea what your LTV is because you have negative churn, right? So think of an Uber, where year 1, you use them 4 times a month. Year 2, you use them 6 times a month. Year 5, you use them 16 times a month. Plus, you started buying an Uber Eats. So yeah, maybe you lost 20% of your customers or 25% of your customers to Lyft, but the remaining customers are buying so much more that your revenue per customer is growing dramatically. And so if you have negative churn, then you don't even know how valuable your customers end up being. Those are the best businesses. Now, not a requirement, but it would be amazing. And then lastly, is your valuation reasonable in light of the opportunity, in light of the team, in light of the market size? And we're price sensitive. And so we have, in the back of our mind, heuristics as to what we think are fair valuations in light of traction per stage. And many of the reasons we pass actually are things become overpriced, especially the best companies. The valuations get out of hand, and we decide, okay, we're not investing, or we're not doing pro rata on a follow-on round. And that's basically it.
So it seems like you've given a lot of thought to this. I felt like I was in your 1-hour meeting just now. Now, this is very polished, the way that you've explained it. Was it always like this out of the gate, or has it evolved over time, your thinking on how you assess these companies?
It was reasonably polished early on because I used the exact same heuristics and thesis for evaluating whether to build a company and what company to build. I was like Marc-Antoine at the very beginning. I had no idea what to build, and I had to think through, okay, first principles. What's a ginormous category where I hate the user experience, and the user and the economics could be improved, and the user experience would be improved by building marketplaces? And then how do I pick which business to build? And while the genius is in the execution, picking the right idea does play a fundamental role. And so I used a version of this. It was not quite as polished, even back in '98, to come up with my first business idea. Though, like Marc-Antoine, I did arbitrage at that time, built an eBay copy for France and Southern Europe before focusing more on business model innovation in the latter years. In terms of investment heuristics, it became polished pretty early because I never set out to be a VC. I never set out to be an angel investor, by the way. But when you're a consumer-facing internet CEO, a lot of other young entrepreneurs come and ask for money and advice. And I thought it was really cool and interesting, and so I started investing. And so I had to define pretty quickly how to select who to invest in. And so I'm like, okay, I'm only going to do things I know and understand and like, marketplaces, and I need to create a selection criteria for a thesis and a criteria for validating companies very quickly. And even then, it started taking too much time. And so by 2013, when I sold OLX, my classified site, I already had 100 investments. In fact, most people thought I was an angel investor because I had one company I was running and 100 companies I was an investor in. And after that, I was like, hey, I like doing both. Let's build a platform, which is FJ Labs, that allows me to do both.
So, you have a rich history of being an operator. You started investing as an operator. You developed your thesis as what you wanted to see as an operator. If you were to build a marketplace today, how would you build it? What would you build, and how would you approach it?
So I'll talk about two things. So first principles. What are large categories where the user experience is broken? And I can think of many things, right? Like I hate my relationship with my bank. I hate my relationship with my insurance company, my credit card company. I mean, we're at the very beginning of the tech revolution. 10% of commerce is online, and China is 25%, by the way, so we're actually laggards from that perspective. But healthcare has not been digitized yet. Education has not really been digitized, and healthcare is like 12 to 17% of GDP. Education is 10% of GDP. Public services in countries like Estonia are completely online, and those are 30 to 50% of GDP. So there's still massive opportunities for using marketplaces, especially to reinvent and improve markets. So find a big category where things are broken, you can improve it. Make sure that you can build liquidity. So make sure you can build a marketplace, which means you need to start in a category that is fragmented on both the supply side and the demand side. If either side is concentrated, you're not a marketplace. You're a distributor of their products, and they're going to compress your margin. And so make sure there's enough fragmentation on both sides. Typically, then you need to think through, okay, how do I get the flywheel going? Do I start with the chicken and egg problem of every marketplace? Do I start with supply or demand? 99% of marketplaces are demand constrained. So start with the supply, because the supply as an economic incentive to be listed on your platform. And be honest, right? You go to your suppliers and say, look, I'm launching. I don't have any demand for you, but we're free to list. So why not? And make sure you highly curate that supply to make sure you have the very best supply to create an amazing user experience for your early customers. And then you get going. Then you pick the business model. Now, there are 4 business models that people use in marketplaces. Of one that I like best. You have listing fee models, which is the old Kijiji, Craigslist model, or Monster.com model. You have visibility models, like advertising. They have really high gross in that margin, but a little bit at scale. You have SaaS fee models if you're giving a SaaS tool. But frankly, especially in the B2B marketplaces, I actually like giving the SaaS away, the platform away for free in order to build the network on the buy side or the supply side or the demand side, and then take a rake.
Do you have an example of someone who's done that really well?
There's a company called RigUp, which is a platform for managing for oil services companies to manage their contractors. So they went to Schlumberger and they're like, hey, we're going to give you this platform to manage your contractors. We're going to give it to you for free forever. And we promise to never charge you for it. Schlumberger's like, wow, this is the best idea ever. We'll sign up. What they didn't realize is when they signed up all their contractors on it, they basically put the entire supply of the platform for free. And what percentage of the contractors' time were they using? 5%. So then the platform went to the contractors and said, hey, the remaining 95% of your time, we'll find you jobs and we'll take a percentage for that. Or, and then from a business model perspective, they can say, hey, you're getting paid in 45 days. We'll take 5%, but we'll pay you now. And most workers don't realize that the implied APR of that is like 50 or 60%, but they're up for it because they get the cash early. And so it creates amazing businesses. So I actually like the free SaaS to building a platform in the back end. That said, sometimes charging for the SaaS to make sure your customers are committed makes sense as well. So I'm not saying it's a bad idea. And then the last but not least, of course, the rake model, where you take a percentage. But you need to think really long and hard. Are you taking the percentage on the buy side or the sell side? And what is the percentage? I mean, the rakes go from literally 0.5% to 75% in the stock photography space because the suppliers are willing to give it essentially away for free. And usually it's driven by what the elasticity of demand and supply is. So you put the rake on the most inelastic part of the demand curve. But you can actually test what that is, right? Like you can actually get a sense by just going to Google and like trying different price points and figuring out how the demand curve and the supply curve look to figure out what the correct rake looks like.
Sometimes it feels like I'm talking to a textbook.
Well, I think in frameworks and the McKinsey background, where probably helps from that perspective in terms of like, one idea per page and 3 bullet points, et cetera. Like, so
source at the bottom.
It makes it easier.
Team analysis.
It makes it easier. Yeah, always team analysis. It makes it easier to communicate it. So you apply this, and then I would, so today, to be specific, I would build a marketplace pick model where the marketplace is picking the supplier, whomever that is, probably on a rake model, starting with the supply side in a vertical. Now, in which industry, in which category, et cetera, TBD. Now, in my case, given my history, it would have to be something really, really big for it to be compelling.
Which brings me sort of my next point. You've sort of brought up how your McKinsey training has given you this sort of textbook-like knowledge or dedication to the craft. We talked a little bit how you would explore what you would do next. It would have to be something really, really big. Could you talk to us about how you've in the past considered transitions in your career and how you've ended up sort of making some of those large decisions?
So I find that most people go through major life decisions kind of because they're expected and they don't actually think them through. It's like, oh, I graduated college and I'm going to get a job. I get the job and maybe I get an apartment and then I get a girlfriend and then we get engaged and then we get married and then we get 2 kids and a half and a dog.
This is becoming real quick.
For whatever reason, this is kind of the societal norm and the societal expectation, and no one wonders, is that right for them? Like your society seems to put pressure on you, your parents, your friends, you put pressure on yourself. Why is that the case that this is what it needs to be? And I feel that we're more like in the Matrix where some rules can be bent and others can be broken, and it's useful to actually take a step back and instead of being on the treadmill where these decisions are kind of happening by default, and by the way, following and the easiest thing to do is keep doing what you were doing before or doing what everyone else is doing, and try to actually think through, okay, in light of, am I really satisfied with the current situation and what are the options available, and have this framework. So what I do is at least every 2 years, I send myself a very long email analyzing where I am in life and the pros and cons of that, and what is my underlying mindset, both in professional life and personal life, and then what are all the options available to me, with no constraints. I mean, and some of the options I wrote could be like become a public intellectual, run parts of Cuba. Well, not really, actually. I try to create a free trade zone in Cuba. I mean, I try to do a whole bunch of things. Now, there are 2 times that you should do this. One is if you're feeling a certain malaise, then for sure you should do this. You're not particularly satisfied in the job you're in. You're not particularly satisfied in the relationship you're in. Then actually taking a step back. But actually, maybe it's even more important to do it if you actually haven't asked yourself, am I going down the right path for me? And what are the options without actually putting any constraints? I write these down. They are pretty long emails. I end up with, I don't know, 20,000 words, and there's like 9 or 10 ideas. I share them with friends. Now, my friends are rather different from me. They don't typically have necessarily perspectives that are relevant for me, but the questions they ask allows me to crystallize my thinking. And by the way, there's power in putting your thoughts to paper because it forces you to be more clear. What is it you really like or dislike? Now, when I do that, I don't try to idealize any of those jobs. It's like, what is the day in the typical day in the life of doing X, Y, Z? These interactions and iterations typically lead to what comes on its own the right response. And one of the things I do, and that's step 3 in my decision-making framework, which I haven't published yet, is I end up actually trying a lot of things on the list. I throw a lot of spaghetti on the list, on the wall, and see if it sticks, and including in my personal life. And then ultimately, the things that work kind of come bubble to the top. It's like being an entrepreneur. Like, use the same iterative testing framework. Like, when you're launching a business, you try everything. Like, you test for names, you test for business models, you test, like, is the button blue, green, or red? Does it say list or sell or list for free? You test everything. And using that same iterative design to your entire life is super useful to actually be going down the path that is more deliberate and right for you.
Can you give us an example of, maybe this is too personal, but sometime you threw some spaghetti at the wall of your personal life and maybe it didn't stick?
Well, in 2012, in 2012, I threw a lot of spaghetti on the wall because I was like CEO of OLX. I had thousands of employees, were part of a publicly traded company, highly respected, and yet was not feeling particularly happy in the job because, frankly, being a public company CEO is really boring. You're creating budgets and you're updating the budget and you're making sure you hit the budget, and it's really, really, really boring. And it's not what I wanted to be doing. I wanted to be building product and meeting entrepreneurs. And at the same time, I was like, to go to the personal life point, I was like, as we're getting older, I find that the quality of my friendships is fraying. I used to, when I was at McKinsey, my best friends and I would like remake the world every night and play foosball, and we'd see each other 5 days a week, and frankly, more often 7 days a week. And now I see them once every other month. And while we are still very close friends, it becomes the biographical update. Oh, this is what my husband has been up to. This is my job. This is my kids. And it's not nearly as profound and meaningful and transformational as it was in the past. And so what I decided to try, I gave all my possessions away to charity. I went down to 50 items, and I was like, I'm going to force my friends to interact with me in a proper way. I'm going to live on their couches. So I gave up. I gave everything away. I gave my house, my apartment, my car, my furniture. Went down to 50 items, and I'm like, I'm just going to live on my friends' couches for the next few years. What I learned rather rapidly was that Benjamin Franklin once said that fish, like house guests, start swelling after 3 days. And the problem is embedding yourself in people's lives when they actually have a life doesn't quite work, because they still have to get up in the morning and bring the kids to school and go to work, et cetera. And I'm also really high energy. And I'm like, my vision was like, oh, I go home at 8, and we play tennis from 8 to 10, and then we have drinks, and then we remake the world, and then we go to bed at 2 or whatever. Like, it wasn't quite compatible. Now, I found through iteration, so that crashed and burned, and realized that staying in Airbnbs and hotels was actually a better idea. Also realized that going on vacation with my friends at places that were easy to get to, with direct flights that were inexpensive, were during the school vacation, which of course I would never want to do, because I'd rather go when no one else is going, at places where there are activities for the kids made it a lot more sense, and to do it in a way where they're away from work and away from school, and where we can actually reconnect. And so now I do that a few times a year, and but it wasn't what I started with from that model.
So Fabrice, we're going to turn over the mics to the audience to ask some questions. But before we do that, you've done a lot of things and continue to do a lot of things, experimenting in your personal life and your business life. You talked about all of the deals that you're reviewing, all of the positions that you're holding in Toronto and beyond. How does someone like you stay focused and efficient, and focus on what matters?
I guess a number of life hacks or tools or tricks of the trade that you pick up along the way. Humans are really, really bad at multitasking. And so I make sure I monotask. So all notifications off and everything. My phone is always on do not disturb mode. It will never ring. It will never vibrate. And because imagine you're in a meeting or you're on a date and your phone vibrates. It takes attention away from the present. You may wonder what's going on. And so it's still not, you can't even be vibrating. You have to be present. So if I'm doing emails, I'm doing emails. And I'm allocating 2 hours to emails. If I'm in a call, I'm doing calls. Now, to guarantee efficiency, now, it also works better because people want to meet me because they want to ask money from me. I'll book 12 back-to-back meetings of 30 minutes a pop. And you have to be on time. If you're 20 minutes late, you get 10 minutes. If you're 31 minutes late, you'll meet you in 2 months. And I'll start the meeting on time and end the meeting on time. And so it imposes a discipline, because most meetings don't need to last more than that. Now, company evaluations, I take 1 hour, so I'll allocate longer. And at the same time in life, you can outsource a lot more than you think. My assistant is Bernadette, is amazing. She's in the Philippines. So I've actually never met her. She manages my entire life, right? She manages the entire agenda. But she'll do things like, oh, you're staying here. Here are all the tennis courts in a 1 mile or 2 mile radius. Here's the ratings. Here's the availability. Can I book them for you? Here are suggested activities for you this week in Toronto. Ooh, these are all your friends who live there. You should probably hang out or interact with them. And I've taken the opportunity to pre-schedule the meetings. Now you can cancel them if you don't want to. When you go on vacation, you take thousands of photos and taking the time to go through the photos or creating albums is really painful and complex. So I went on Upwork and I hired someone in Bangladesh to actually curate the photos, edit them, select them, and create beautiful albums that I share with my friends and family.
Actually, Fabrice was going to outsource this entire speaking engagement to Bernadette. She was going to fly from the Philippines. He was going to be off skiing somewhere.
Yeah. I outsource Tinder. Someone can actually, because Tinder, you can locate yourself somewhere else. You can have someone swipe for you, do the chatting, set up the date, and then of course, you need to give them the guidelines of what you want and what to talk about because it has to sound like you. But then you can just show up with a summary of what you talked about and just show up on the date. So you save so much time. Like, all these things are so inefficient.
A round of applause for Fabrice, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to swipe right on that conversation. And I feel like now there is a ton of interest from the crowd to ask your own questions. So let's get started here. We'll do a nice lengthy Q&A.
Hey, how you doing? I'll pitch you later, but I have 2 questions. First question is a bit of a Tim Ferriss question. What is your morning routine? What do you typically do when you wake up, and how do you set your day? Second question, I love your couch to castle story. Crashed on the couch, have a shower in the office, and things were probably the lowest that they've ever been. Did you know you were going to get to this point, even in those moments, those dark periods? Is that what kept you going? And is that light where I'm going to be like freaking huge and I know it's going to happen? Or were you just like, shit, man, I'm just trying to get to the next day and didn't necessarily have that?
So first question, morning routine. Don't really have a morning routine. I wake up kind of instantaneously on. So if I have a call at 8, I'll wake up at 7:55 and put a t-shirt on and get on the call. Don't eat breakfast, but again, personal preference. And it doesn't matter when the first meeting is. I try to wake up just 5 minutes before then. In terms of, in the past when things were really hard, it never occurred to me that I wouldn't be doing anything else, right? I like building companies. I like building something out of nothing. I always wanted to be an entrepreneur. I was actually really happy. Like, even when none of the trappings of success and when things were really complicated and difficult, people overestimate the risks that we take. I mean, the reality is, by virtue of being here in the West, having the opportunity to be in this position probably means a certain level of IQ, ambition, grit. That means no matter what happens, we'd fall back on our feet. Like, went bankrupt, I could go back to McKinsey. I could start at the next startup, and if it failed, it doesn't really matter. And so I never thought I would become as successful or big as it did, but it didn't particularly bother me. I was really happy doing what I was doing.
You talked about you look for ginormous opportunities where the user experience is broken. More often than not, those ginormous opportunities where the user experience continues to be broken is because of a tremendous amount of inertia. Inertia in culture, inertia in business process, et cetera. So when you're evaluating a company, or better yet, in the scenario where you were to launch the company, would you look for a company that has the capital, the resources to actually be the disruptor, or do you look for unit economics where I can survive long enough for the world to change?
So first of all, in terms of total addressable market size, you can build large companies in smallish markets. I mean, we're investors in a company called Reverb, which is a music instrument marketplace. They're doing $600 million a year in GMV. I mean, and if you and everyone was like, "Oh, that's a niche; it's too small." I mean, $600 million a year in GMV, and it probably will be a few billion in GMV in the next few years. So things that sound niche can end up being a lot larger than you think. I suspect that the TAM to shoot for on a minimum size is maybe $5 billion a year, but it could be $5 billion. It may not even exist in the secondary market yet, and you can create it, right? If your primary market is $5 billion a year, chances are you can create a secondary market that's large enough, even though it doesn't exist. To answer the second question, or the more larger or broader question, it's good to have good unit economics regardless, because it gives you the staying power, and also, look, to put it differently, I want both. I want both to disrupt an industry and have a better user experience and really profoundly reinvent it, but it only really truly works if you have unit economics in the long run. If your unit economics are not good, the problem is there's a day where the music stops. And while the going is good and you're raising a lot of capital and people believe in you and your growth rate and revenue to top line is great, that's amazing. But if the financing environment changes, you can still die. And there are companies that have grown to be really, really big that then blew up because the unit economics were never quite there. Now, there's counterexamples where you can lose money kind of for a very, very, very long time if capital is there. But I'd rather be in the first category, right? Like the survival rate if you don't have a business model is maybe 0.1%, and the survival rate if you do is like 5%. Now, it's still pretty low, but it's 50x higher.
Hey, Fabrice. I've been to a lot of TechTO events, as Jason can attest to, and by far, I think this is one of the most informative talks that I've ever attended. So thank you very much. And so with that in mind, I learned so much, and I was busy taking notes, and I didn't cover everything. So I was searching through your website, and I couldn't find a lot of the information that you touched on. Like, are you thinking about releasing a book or something that kind of really explains how to build these sort of marketplaces?
So I do blog a fair amount on how to make decisions, what are the trends in technology. There, in one of my blog posts are the trends in marketplaces. I'm going to publish in the next few weeks probably a blog post on building marketplaces. So and what are the trends, what are the steps, how do you pick the right business model. So it'll cover a fair amount of that. Book, probably not in the near term. It's just wrong allocation of time in terms of output on humanity. I think the reason I like technology, and the reason I'm doing this, frankly, is I like harnessing the deflationary power of technology to make the world a better place by making things cheaper for a broader audience. And when you think about it, I mean, it's definitely true over the last 140 years where water, electricity, transportation, communications were all extraordinarily expensive. But it's also true even in our lifetime, right? When I was a kid, only the rich took planes. Only the rich had like these ginormous cell phones that really didn't work and cost $20 a minute. And now these have become mass market because technology is allowing them to become a lot cheaper. And so the reason I like marketplaces and technology writ large is it harnesses this technology to really improve people's quality of life and purchasing power.
So on that note, what is a good user experience?
Something that delights you. It's kind of like if you see it, you know what it is. Right. The first time you use Uber, it was extraordinary. Right. The first time you use Google and you realize that the search actually worked, it was extraordinary. And so, I don't know, simple and delightful.
Yeah. So. We're good? Okay. So I work for a company called OpenCare, and we're a health place over here. In the back.
Way in the back.
Yeah. So we are a healthcare marketplace where we connect patients with vetted dentists around them. So speak about an industry that we absolutely hate, it's the dental industry. So the one challenge that we've been having is we have constraints from supply side, and we're trying to make demand meet those constraints. And kind of what we said, we started with supply and trying to grow that. Have you ever seen any marketplaces where demand has met supply? Because we tried multiple experiments to do that, but none of the metrics have moved. What have you seen in your experience between whether supply should meet demand or demand should meet supply?
Yeah, so in most marketplaces, because there's a financial incentive for the supplier to be on the platform, you focus on the supply and then you get the demand. And by curating and having the highest quality supplier, you create fantastic experiences for the early demand, and you try to match it. Ideally, you want to represent like 20, 30, 40% of the revenues of your suppliers, because then they're loyal to your platform and they really value you. That's why you should never have like an infinite pool of suppliers that you don't send any traffic to, and really match the two. A few markets are supply constrained, but they're really the exception. So we're investors in a company called Rebag, which is a handbag marketplace. And so if you get the latest Birkin, it'll literally, the sell-through rate is 100%. If you have a Birkin on the marketplace. And so for them, getting supply is hard. Or we were in art marketplaces. I mean, so there are a few markets that are supply constrained, but 99% are really demand constrained. And the hard part is finding the correct strategy for acquiring the demand, whether it's SEO, whether it's viral and your N is greater than 1, whether it's like paid acquisition and in various channels or sales driven. I mean, it really depends on your industry. It's just making sure you get the economics and really making sure that you always scale your demand in line with your supply, right? You never want them to be out of balance, otherwise you're going to create a bad user experience on one of the two sides of the experience of the marketplace.
One last question, and then Fabrice will be here to answer a few questions, if you can get to him between the stage and the airport. And then we'll have some time to also chat amongst ourselves and continue the conversations right after this.
Awesome. So thank you so much for sharing those insights. Hi, I'm here. Maybe I should stand up. Just wanted to ask your, I guess, advice on, so you talked a little bit about writing yourself a letter and like evaluating where you are in life. So I really thought that was super cool. I also wanted to hear about, do you set goals and for yourself, like short-term, long-term goals for your life, or do you just kind of go with the flow and see how things are going?
No, I absolutely set goals. Both, and look, these are artificial constraints, right? Like the dates that we have in the world. But yeah, I try to have a goal for the year and medium difficulty goals and higher difficulty goals, personal and professional. And to keep track of them and I gauge myself, but they're all measurable, right? Like the beauty of something that's measured is you know whether you're succeeding or not. And I keep track of them personally. And then at the end of the year, I have a tendency to write a summary of the year. And frankly, the things that went well, the things that went badly, and I actually write this publicly, including my predictions for the year. So I make macroeconomic predictions on like when the next recession is going to hit, et cetera. And then I'm like, okay, did I get it right or wrong? And the reason why, for instance, and I talk about also a lot of the failures I've had, right? Like my last big year in review was giving up in two of the most meaningful personal projects I've been working on for like 5 years, and why they failed and why I gave up on them, and why those goals had not been reached, and the lessons to get from them. So no, absolutely, I set them. I actually try to set them reasonably publicly, and then at the end of the year, both look at the accomplishments towards those goals and also what I gave up on.
Awesome. Fabrice, thank you. It's getting hot up here. I'm going to turn off the fireplace. A huge thank you to Fabrice and all of our speakers here this evening.